Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. It is Friday, August 29th, 2025, here in New York City, and as the summer air lingers warm across the avenues, the day's headlines arrive with a curious mixture of triumph and unease. The numbers look impressive. America's economy has just reported a stronger than expected growth rate, with second quarter GDP revised upward to 3.3%. On Wall Street, the S&P 500 has soared to a new all-time closing high, passing the 6,500 mark and feeding the belief that prosperity is once again firmly in our grasp. Yet behind the celebration, subtle cracks show through. Oil prices have swung, unpredictably, this week falling on signs of weaker demand, only to rebound as geopolitical worries flared. For ordinary Americans, this push and pull feels like living on shifting sands. The paycheck arrives, but bills grow steeper. The stock market rises, but the cost of gasoline whispers caution. If all this sounds strangely familiar, that's because history has played this tune before. In the late 1920s, too, the newspapers declared that growth was permanent, that the market had reached a new plateau, and that prosperity had finally become an American birthright. Crowds danced to jazz, skyscrapers glistened, and optimism felt like the national currency. But only a year later, that glittering facade collapsed into the Great Depression, and the world was reminded how fragile even the strongest numbers can be. And yet, here lies the paradox that will guide our story tonight. Collapse is rarely just an ending. More often, it is the soil from which new beginnings grow. In the darkest years of the 1930s, when banks were failing and breadlines stretched across the blocks of this very city, something curious was taking shape in the world of entertainment. Walt Disney, armed with little more than stubbornness and imagination, was building stories that would outlast the hunger, the despair, and even the depression itself. Against all odds, he introduced a mouse who whistled, danced, and laughed. And somehow, this simple cartoon character restored a fragment of hope to millions. So as we sit here in 2025, listening to the hum of markets and watching oil prices jump and falter, it may be worth remembering that what looks like stability can quickly turn, and what looks like collapse may yet become creation. Tonight we will wander back to that era of hardship and discover how a world that seemed broken gave rise to something magical, something lasting. For hidden inside every crisis is the quiet possibility of opportunity, waiting for those bold enough to see it. The story we are about to unfold is not merely about one man or one company, but about a rhythm that echoes across centuries. The strange companionship between ruin and rebirth, when economies stumble, when markets unravel, when the nightly news tells us that the ground beneath our feet is no longer secure. It is tempting to believe that the only direction left is downward. Yet history reminds us that within the deepest valleys often lie the seeds of the next ascent. The Great Depression, remembered today as one of the darkest chapters of modern times, offers a perfect lens for this paradox. Imagine the 1930s in America. Nearly 1 in 4 workers without a job, factories shuttered, farms abandoned, and families carrying their belongings in battered suitcases as they searched for survival. Breadlines stretched down city blocks. Men in worn suits stood silently, waiting for bowls of soup that might quiet the ache in their stomachs. Banks, once pillars of community confidence, closed their doors and locked away the savings of ordinary families. It was a decade defined not only by scarcity of money, but also by scarcity of hope. And yet out of that scarcity came an astonishing burst of creativity. It was during these same years that Hollywood produced some of its most enduring works, that writers gave voice to the struggles and resilience of ordinary people, and that entrepreneurs dared to gamble on ideas that seemed absurd in the shadow of hunger. Among them was Walt Disney, a man whose early failures would have crushed many. but whose stubborn dream of bringing joy through animation somehow flourished when the world least expected it. His studio risked everything on experiments synchronized sound in Steamboat Willie, color in flowers and trees, and finally the audacious vision of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. A full-length animated feature at a time when even seasoned businessmen dismissed the idea as folly. The Depression, in this sense, did not merely destroy it, created the very conditions that made people crave escape, laughter, and magic. Families who could not afford new clothes or vacations still saved a few coins to buy a movie ticket, to sit in a darkened theater where, for 90 minutes, the weight of the world could be set aside. In giving them that, Disney not only survived the Depression, but built the foundation of an empire that would stretch across generations. And Disney was not alone. Across history, moments of collapse have again and again served as unlikely incubators of opportunity. Out of war, new industries have emerged. Out of financial panics, new regulations and technologies have taken root. Out of despair, new forms of art and culture have been born. The 1930s simply crystallized this truth with particular clarity, that while crisis destroys old certainties, it also forces imagination to take risks it might never have dared in times of comfort. As we journey through this story together tonight, we will move gently between the past and the present. We will revisit the breadlines and broken banks of the 1930s, not to linger in their misery, but to see how resilience and invention quietly threaded through those years. And as we hold those images in our mind, we will glance back at our own present moment in America that today celebrates record highs in the stock market and stronger growth than anticipated. Even while oil jitters and geopolitical tremors remind us of fragility, the echoes are unmistakable. The lesson is not that we should fear every celebration or expect collapse at every turn. Rather, it is that we should understand prosperity and crisis as two sides of a single coin, forever trading places in history's hand. To listen to this rhythm is to recognize that our own challenges, whether economic uncertainty, technological disruption, or political division may be, in their own strange way, the soil from which tomorrow's dreams will grow. And so, let us begin this quiet journey into the Great Depression, not simply to trace its despair, but to uncover the unexpected brilliance that emerged from its shadows. For in that tale, we may find not only the story of Disney's rise, but also a gentle reminder that even in 2025, when prosperity seems dazzling yet fragile, the possibility of creation still lingers just beneath the surface. And before we move deeper, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe if you enjoy these reflections. Leave a like if you wish to support this quiet exploration, and share your thoughts in the comments. Even in history's darkest nights, conversation can be its own kind of light. In the late 1920s, Hollywood was a curious place, half dream factory, half chaotic carnival. Silent films still filled theaters with stars whose lips moved, but whose voices no one had ever heard. While a new invention called synchronized sound was beginning to disrupt the entire industry. Studios that had been comfortable producing silent dramas suddenly found themselves scrambling to adapt, terrified that audiences would no longer tolerate the silence they once adored. It was a moment of change, and in that moment of change, opportunity lay hidden. For the American public, the movie theater was already becoming a sanctuary. Tickets were cheap enough that even working families could afford to step inside a darkened room and, for a few hours, forget the worries of rent or work. Films did not just entertain, they stitched together a new kind of national culture, where people from New York to Kansas laughed at the same jokes and gasped at the same adventures. The silver screen was a mirror that made America feel more united than its politics or its finances ever could. Yet behind the glamour of Hollywood premieres and flashing lights, the industry was far from secure. Studios were gambling on expensive technologies, Stars demanded higher pay, and audiences, fickle as always, were ready to shift their loyalty overnight. It was, in many ways, a miniature version of America itself in 1928, glittering on the surface, but with cracks just beneath. The newspapers spoke endlessly of prosperity. Stock prices were soaring, skyscrapers rising, radios humming in every living room. But just as banks had stretched themselves thin on speculation, many studios were stretched on credit, gambling that tomorrow's box office would cover today's reckless spending. It was into this fragile yet fertile world that a young animator named Walt Disney was trying to carve his place. He was not a mogul yet, not even close. In fact, he was a man haunted by failure. Only a few years earlier, his Lafogram studio in Kansas City had collapsed, leaving him broke and humiliated. He moved west to Los Angeles with little more than a suitcase and a box of drawings. Hollywood, already full of bigger names and sharper elbows, did not exactly roll out the red carpet for him. To survive, Disney sold short cartoons, relying on scrappy contracts and a bit of charm. The story might have ended there if not for one bitter betrayal. Disney had created a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, which briefly gave him a foothold in the industry. But when his distributor decided to cut him out of the deal and poach his animators, Disney was left with nothing. For many, that would have been the final blow, proof that Hollywood was a place where the powerful crushed the dreamers. But for Disney, the loss of Oswald became the spark of reinvention. On the train ride home, he began sketching a little. Mouse, cheerful and mischievous. The kind of character who could withstand all the bad luck of the world and still grin. This was the seed of Mickey Mouse, though at the time, no one could have guessed it. Mickey's timing was uncanny. In 1928, as Wall Street tickers sang with record-breaking highs, and America congratulated itself on permanent prosperity, Mickey whistled his way onto the screen in Steamboat Willie. The short film was not only charming, it was revolutionary. For the first time, audiences heard a cartoon character's voice synchronized perfectly with his movements, a technical marvel that felt almost magical. People laughed, clapped, and came back again. At the very moment when America was dancing at the edge of a cliff, Disney had introduced a mouse who seemed to laugh at danger itself. It is tempting, looking back, to see this as coincidence, but history is full of such strange alignments. In our own time, in 2025, when America celebrates GDP growth of 3.3% and Wall Street's record highs, it is worth remembering how quickly glitter can fade. Just as silent films gave way to talkies in a blink, prosperity can give way to panic almost overnight. Yet within these shifts lies possibility. Just as the movie industry's upheaval created space for an unknown animator to introduce Mickey Mouse, so too may today's uncertainties conceal the seeds of tomorrow's empires. For Disney, the world of the late 1920s was not secure, but it was enough. Hollywood's chaos, its experiments, its very fragility gave him the opening he needed. Mickey Mouse did not begin as an empire. He began as a sketch born from loss, launched into a world that believed prosperity would last forever. What no one knew then was that the crash was just months away, and that this little mouse would become more than a cartoon. He would become a companion through America's darkest years. Every empire begins, not with triumph, but with betrayal. For Walt Disney, the pivotal moment came not when he was celebrated, but when he was swindled. In the spring of 1928, just as his modest studio in Los Angeles was beginning to find its rhythm, he discovered that the character he thought would secure his future, Oswald, the Lucky Rabbit, was not his to keep. Oswald had been a modest success. The rabbit was energetic, mischievous, and charming enough to win audiences in a marketplace crowded with talking animals and slapstick humor. Disney and his small team of animators poured their energy into him, producing shorts that distributors eagerly sold. For a brief moment, Walt felt he had escaped the failures of Kansas City, that Hollywood was finally beginning to acknowledge his vision. But success, especially in a booming era like the late 1920s, was rarely safe. Charles Mintz, Disney's distributor through Universal Pictures, quietly negotiated contracts with most of Disney's animators behind his back. One by one, his staff agreed to leave him, lured by the promise of steady pay and the security of working for a major studio. When Walt confronted Mintz, he was told bluntly, Oswald belonged to Universal, not to him. If he wanted to stay, it would be as an employee, not as an owner. For Walt, who had already tasted bankruptcy once, this was a bitter revelation. He had built the rabbit, nurtured him, given him life frame by frame, and yet the law considered Oswald nothing more than property of a distributor. Overnight, the future he had imagined collapsed. On a train ride back from New York, where the betrayal became clear, he had to face the humiliating truth. He had been outmaneuvered, his team stripped away, and his creation stolen. Most men might have resigned themselves at that point, accepting a stable job and swallowing their pride. But Disney was too stubborn, too restless. Sitting in that train carriage, he began to sketch in his notebook. A mouse emerged, simple, cheerful, resilient, the kind of creature that could survive 1,000 misfortunes and still find a way to smile. Later he would say that Mickey was born from necessity, but in truth he was born from loss. The betrayal of Oswald is often retold as a footnote in Disney's history, but it was the crucible that shaped everything that followed. Without it, Mickey Mouse might never have existed. And there is a lesson in that irony. It was only by losing his supposed guarantee of success that Walt was forced to innovate again, to gamble again, to imagine something better. In many ways, this mirrored the larger American story on the eve of the Great Depression. Just as Walt discovered that the prosperity of Oswald was an illusion, Americans would soon discover that their stock market gains and easy credit were just as fragile. In 1928, bankers and brokers promised endless growth, just as Mintz had promised. Disney's stability. Both promises would shatter within a year. If this parallel feels familiar in 2025, it should. Today, as headlines celebrate record-high stock indexes and stronger-than-expected GDP growth, there is a similar temptation to believe that prosperity is secure. But history whispers caution. What is taken for granted can vanish overnight. And, sometimes, as Walt Disney learned, the very act of losing what we thought was permanent can be the spark that drives us to create something unforgettable. Oswald, the rabbit, faded into obscurity, a relic of an age that promised much and delivered little. But from his shadow stepped Mickey Mouse, whose whistling debut in Steamboat Willie would change not only Disney's fortunes, but also the course of American entertainment. Betrayal, in hindsight, was the price of reinvention. The mouse was born, on paper, but he came to life on a steamboat. In November of 1928, just as Wall Street tickers were singing their euphoric song of endless gains, audiences in New York gathered in a modest theater to witness something they had never seen before. The short film was called Steamboat Willie, and its star was a cheerful, wide-eyed mouse with a mischievous grin. He whistled, he danced, and most astonishing of all, his every movement was synchronized perfectly with the sound that filled the theater. It is hard for us today, accustomed to surround sound and dazzling effects, to imagine what a shock this was. Before Steamboat Willie, cartoons were silent, accompanied only by live music in the theater. Characters moved, but they never truly spoke or sang. Now, for the first time, a little mouse could whistle a tune in perfect rhythm, bang pots and pans in harmony with the soundtrack, and make the entire audience laugh out loud. It was not just funny, it was revolutionary. Walt Disney had gambled everything on this idea. He and his team had studied sound synchronization tirelessly, experimenting with how to match frames to beats. The technology was so new that even established studios hesitated to risk it. But Walt had little left to lose. After Oswald had been stolen from him, he had only Mickey, and Mickey had to succeed. If the mouse failed, the studio would collapse. If he succeeded, Disney might just have a future. The mouse did more than succeed. Audiences adored him. They laughed at his antics, clapped at the synchronization, and left the theater with a tune stuck in their heads. Newspapers praised the innovation, calling it a marvel of modern entertainment. Within months, Mickey Mouse had become a household name, his image spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Children begged for more shorts, and adults found themselves charmed by the cheerful resilience of a mouse, who seemed to face every challenge with a grin. The timing was almost comically ironic. In 1928, America was intoxicated with prosperity. Stock prices climbed relentlessly. Brokers assured investors that the market had entered a new era, and magazines celebrated the ingenuity of modern industry. In that heady atmosphere, Mickey seemed perfectly at home, a symbol of playfulness, joy, and the triumph of technology. What no one yet realized was that within a year, banks would fail, fortunes would evaporate, and the very audiences laughing at Mickey would be standing in breadlines. And here is where the deeper meaning begins to take shape. Mickey Mouse was not just a cartoon character, he was a mirror. At first he reflected the optimism of the late 1920s. That peculiar mixture of innocence and arrogance that believed prosperity could last forever. But when the crash came, Mickey did not vanish. Instead, he adapted, becoming a companion through hardship. In Depression-era America, Mickey's laughter was not just entertainment, it was resilience. Walt himself once admitted that Mickey was everything he wished he could be. Bold when he felt uncertain, cheerful when he felt despair, resourceful when reality seemed cruel. In this way, Mickey embodied not only Disney's own struggles, but also the spirit of millions of Americans trying to smile through the pain of lost jobs and empty wallets. The little mouse, who whistled on a steamboat, became, quite by accident, a national symbol of survival. When we glance at our own time in 2025, the parallel is hard to ignore. Just as Americans in 1928 laughed at Mickey under the illusion of permanent prosperity, today's headlines celebrate GDP growth of 3.3% and stock markets breaking records. The mood feels buoyant, almost invincible. Yet oil prices twitch. Nervously, geopolitics grow tense, and beneath the shine lies fragility. We cannot know if the cracks will widen into collapse, but history suggests that if they do, new forms of creativity will rise to meet the moment. For Disney, Steamboat Willie was not just a short cartoon. It was the hinge of his entire life. The moment when failure turned into possibility, when betrayal gave way to reinvention. For America, it became something similar. A reminder that even in a world perched unknowingly on the brink of disaster, joy could still be found in the whistle of a mouse. By the time 1929 dawned, Mickey Mouse had grown from a sketch in Walt's notebook into something far larger than anyone could have expected. The little whistling mouse, barely a year old, was no longer just a cartoon figure. He was beginning to symbolize an entire mood, the restless optimism of America perched at the height of the Roaring Twenties. Audiences couldn't get enough of him. Each new short drew crowds. Children imitated Mickey's gestures, and newspapers wrote admiring pieces about how this mouse had captured the spirit of the age. To a country brimming with jazz rhythms, stock market euphoria, and technological novelty, Mickey felt like the perfect mascot. Modern, playful, and always moving forward. He seemed to laugh at limits. He boarded steamboats, wrangled animals, banged pots into makeshift symphonies and, always with a grin that never faltered. Disney himself admitted that Mickey carried the optimism he sometimes struggled to muster. Walt was constantly negotiating debts, worrying about payroll, and trying to keep his fragile studio alive. Yet on screen, Mickey never showed fatigue or doubt. He was the embodiment of resilience, a tiny figure telling audiences that life could be mischievous, joyful, and full of possibility, and people believed him. They needed to believe him, but the symbolism went deeper. Mickey arrived at precisely the moment when Americans were telling themselves that prosperity was permanent. Brokers on Wall Street promised endless returns, advertisements, declared that every home could afford radios, cars, and refrigerators, and newspapers announced that science and industry had banished old fears of recession. Mickey's cheerfulness fit seamlessly into this grand narrative. If even a mouse could whistle his way through chaos, surely America itself could only march forward. The irony, of course, is sharp. Mickey debuted in 1928 and reached his first peak of popularity in 1929, the very year the illusion of endless growth shattered. He was born into optimism, but destined to live through despair. In this way, he became more than a reflection of prosperity. He became a bridge, carrying audiences from one emotional world to another. When banks closed and families lost their savings, the mouse did not disappear. He was still there on the screen, whistling, laughing, daring people to smile again. If you look closely, that resilience explains why Mickey endured, while other animated characters of the era faded. There were plenty of competitors: Felix, the cat, Crazy Cat, Betty Boop, Oswald the rabbit, but most of them carried either the innocence of the boom years or the cynicism of vaudeville humor. Mickey was different. He was cheerful without being naive, mischievous without being cruel. He seemed to understand hardship while refusing to be crushed by it. In that balance lay his genius. In many ways, America in 2025 faces a similar paradox. The numbers shimmer: GDP at 3.3% growth, the S&P 500 breaking new records, technology companies expanding into realms once thought impossible. And yet, as oil prices wobble and geopolitical tensions sharpen, the smile feels a little too wide, the laughter a little too loud. Like the audiences of 1929, we tell ourselves that the future can only be brighter. But history whispers otherwise. Perhaps that is why Mickey's story still resonates. He reminds us that optimism is not the same as denial. It is not about pretending hardship doesn't exist. It is about facing it with humor and imagination. For the families of 1929, Mickey was a playful companion as they stepped unknowingly into the storm. For us today, his whistle is a reminder that even in times of uncertainty, the act of smiling itself can be a kind of defiance. Mickey Mouse was not merely a cartoon. He was America's grin at the edge of the abyss, a small, brave gesture of optimism just before the crash. And when the crash came, he would prove that such gestures mattered more than anyone could have imagined. History often delights in cruel ironies, and few are sharper than the timing of Mickey Mouse's debut. In November 1928, Steamboat Willie made audiences laugh with its synchronized sound and cheerful mouse. By the summer of 1929, Mickey had become a cultural sensation. Children drew him in their schoolbooks, theaters clamored for more shorts, and Walt Disney began to believe he had finally escaped the shadows of failure. All of this unfolded just as America itself was dancing on the edge of disaster. The country in 1929 was still intoxicated by prosperity. Radios crackled in living rooms, automobiles crowded city streets, and stock tickers rattled endlessly, spitting out numbers that seemed to promise a future of limitless wealth. Magazines proclaimed that the United States had entered a new era free from the old cycles of boom and bust. Bankers assured clients that markets could only rise. Housewives bought stocks on margin, and office clerks whispered about the fortunes they would make. It was optimism, inflated and unmoored from reality, the same kind of optimism that Mickey embodied on screen. And then, in October 1929, the floor gave way. The stock market crashed with a violence few could comprehend. Billions in paper wealth vanished in days. Brokers who had boasted of endless prosperity jumped from windows. Banks, weakened by speculation, began to totter. Ordinary investors, school teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, watched their life savings evaporate. What had seemed permanent was suddenly gone, and America awoke to a new world of fear. Yet through this catastrophe, Mickey remained. The little mouse who had debuted in an age of jazz and champagne now found himself whistling through an age of breadlines and hunger. His cheerful antics, once a mirror of prosperity, became something different, a form of defiance against despair. Children who no longer had toys could still laugh at Mickey's mischief. Adults who had lost jobs and dignity could still sit in a theater for a nickel and watch a mouse who refused to quit. In this way, Mickey became less a symbol of prosperity and more a companion through hardship. The irony deepened for Walt himself. Just as his character was gaining fame, the economy that might have supported his ambitions collapsed. Financing became scarce, distributors grew cautious, and the studio often teetered on the edge of insolvency. Yet the demand for Mickey endured, and that demand carried Disney through the leanest years. It was as if the nation, stripped of so much, clung fiercely to the small comfort of laughter. Looking back, it is hard not to see the strange poetry of this timing. Mickey Mouse was born in the last golden glow before nightfall, and his survival through the crash made him more than entertainment. He was proof that optimism could be carried into the storm. That a smile, even the painted smile of an animated mouse, could hold meaning when everything else seemed lost. And if we listen carefully, we can hear the echo today. In 2025, America once again stands in a season of paradox. The economy grows faster than expected, the stock market scales new heights, and headlines announce triumphs. Yet oil prices twitch nervously, politics divide bitterly, and the confidence feels just a little too fragile. History teaches us that such moments are not permanent. But it also teaches us that within collapse lies creation. Somewhere, even now, a new Mickey may be taking shape, ready to offer joy in the shadows of uncertainty. So perhaps that is the lesson of timing. Fortune and disaster often arrive hand in hand, and what seems like a playful cartoon may turn out to be a lifeline. Mickey Mouse was born before the crash, but he lived through it, and in doing so, became a companion to a generation in despair. And now, as we turn from Mickey's debut to the world that crumbled around him, I invite you to stay with me, and if you're still awake, leave a 1 in the comments. It's always good to know who is still walking with us through the quiet corridors of history. October 1929 began like any other month on Wall Street. Crowded brokerages, cigarette smoke curling through the air, and tickers spitting out endless streams of numbers that dazzled the eyes of eager investors. To many, the market seemed unstoppable. In the years leading up to that autumn, the Dow Jones had quadrupled, and talk of permanent prosperity had become almost a national religion. Families that had never before owned stock now borrowed money to buy shares, convinced they could only go up. Clerks, teachers, farmers all dipped into the market, each convinced they were riding a tide that could never ebb. But markets, like all tides, have a habit of turning. By late October, the first cracks were showing. Prices wobbled. Nervous whispers ran through the exchanges. On October 24th, later remembered as Black Thursday, the dam broke. A torrent of sell orders flooded the market, overwhelming the ticker tape. Prices collapsed faster than anyone could read them. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange, their faces a mixture of confusion and dread. as if they were watching the collapse of a world they thought invincible. In the days that followed, the panic deepened. October 29th, Black Tuesday, became the most infamous of all. More than 16 million shares were traded, a record at the time, and values plummeted beyond measure. Fortunes that had taken years to build evaporated in hours. Bankers tried to intervene, pooling money to buy stocks and restore confidence, but their efforts were like tossing pebbles into a flood. Nothing could stop the fall. The human stories were perhaps the most haunting. Investors who had mortgaged their homes to speculate were left with nothing but debt. Families who believed they were securing their children's futures now faced foreclosure. Some brokers, unable to face the ruin, chose to end their lives. The optimism of the Roaring Twenties died not with a whimper, but with the shattering sound of ticker machines, unable to keep pace with the collapse. Yet even in describing such calamity, one cannot help but notice the strange symmetry with other times. In 2025, markets soar again, the S&P 500 setting fresh records, headlines celebrating strong growth. Once more, ordinary citizens are drawn into investments, whether through stocks, real estate, or digital assets, convinced that the upward march is eternal. But history hums a warning tune. Prosperity often masks fragility, and the fall, when it comes, is swift. Back in 1929, the crash did more than wipe away wealthy, it shattered confidence, the intangible glue that holds economies together. Banks, which had invested heavily in the market, now faced insolvency. Businesses, suddenly unable to raise capital, began to fail. Workers lost jobs, farmers lost land, and the spiral of despair deepened. What had begun as a stock market correction became a national catastrophe, and through it all, in theaters scattered across America, Mickey Mouse continued to whistle. It may seem trivial, almost absurd, to think that a cartoon mouse mattered in the midst of such ruin. But for families who had lost everything, an evening spent laughing at Mickey's antics was not nothing. It was, in fact, a quiet rebellion against despair. While Wall Street burned, a mouse danced. And audiences clung to that dance as proof that joy had not entirely vanished. The crash of 1929 stands today as a reminder that illusions of permanence are dangerous. Yet it also reminds us that even when those illusions crumble, life finds unexpected ways to endure. For Walt Disney, the collapse threatened his studio, yet it also ensured that audiences, desperate for escape, kept coming back to the theaters. Mickey's survival was tethered to America's despair. So as we leave the clamor of Black Tuesday behind, the story shifts. What happens after the fall? How does a nation that believed in endless growth adjust to endless want? The answer lies not only in economic charts or political speeches, but in the breadlines, the soup kitchens, and the daily struggles of ordinary people. And it is to that world we now turn to see how Americans endured the long shadow that followed the crash. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, the first reaction across America was disbelief. For weeks, newspapers had promised that the downturn was temporary, that prosperity was too deeply rooted to vanish. But as winter crept in, disbelief gave way to panic. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Unemployment, which had hovered around 3% during the golden glow of the 1920s, began to climb. By the end of 1930, it reached nearly 9%. By 1931, it had doubled again. By 1932, almost 1 in 4 Americans who wanted to work found themselves without jobs. The panic spread like a fever. Factories that had once roared with machines stood silent. Mills closed, smokestacks went cold, and workers were handed envelopes with final paychecks that barely covered a week's rent. Families packed belongings into wagons, boarded trains, or simply walked the roads in search of work that rarely existed. The proud image of America as the land of opportunity was replaced by the sight of long lines of weary men waiting for a chance to sweep floors or unload freight for a few cents. The collapse was not only economic but emotional. A generation that had believed in the promise of endless growth now felt betrayed. Bank failures compounded the despair. Families who had saved diligently for years discovered one morning that their banks had locked their doors. Their savings vanished into the abyss of insolvency. The sense of security that money once provided evaporated. What remained was fear of hunger, fear of homelessness, fear that the future itself had been stolen. Newspapers told stories of men who left home each morning, dressed in suits, carrying empty briefcases, pretending to go to work so their children would not know the truth. Women stretched meals from scraps, watering down soups, baking bread from flour mixed with whatever filler they could find. Children learned to grow silent when parents whispered about bills they could not pay. Panic was no longer confined to Wall Street. It had seeped into kitchens, bedrooms, and schoolyards. And yet, amidst the despair, the movie theaters stayed open. For a nickel, sometimes less, families could buy 2 hours of escape. They could step into the shadows of a theater and let the glow of the screen replace their worries. There, Mickey Mouse still whistled, still laughed, still turned chaos into comedy. The irony was striking. While the nation panicked, a mouse carried on as if nothing were wrong. Perhaps that was why audiences loved him all the more. In a world where optimism felt impossible, Mickey embodied a spirit of cheerfulness that could not be crushed. The panic of unemployment was not simply about lost wages. It was about lost dignity. To work had been, for many Americans, the essence of identity and worth. To stand idle in a breadline was not only humiliating, but destabilizing. Communities that had once thrived on industriousness now seemed hollowed out, their rhythms broken. The rising numbers of unemployed were not abstract figures. They were neighbors, brothers, fathers, friends. Each statistic was a human life, rearranged by forces beyond their control. In 2025, echoes of that fear linger, though in different forms. Headlines celebrate growth and record stock market highs, yet anxieties simmer beneath. Even as numbers shine, many workers wonder if technology, automation, or shifting global winds might sweep their livelihoods away. The lesson of 1929 is not that prosperity is meaningless, but that prosperity without security is fragile, and fragility breeds panic. The surge of unemployment in the early 1930s transformed the crash of 1929 from a financial calamity into a social earthquake. Breadlines, soup kitchens, and the silent march of the jobless became the defining images of an era. America, once so confident in its endless ascent, had fallen into a pit it could scarcely imagine. And yet, from that pit, small lights flickered among them: a mouse who refused to stop smiling, and a dreamer named Walt Disney who refused to stop creating. By the early 1930s, the crash of Wall Street had rippled outward until it reached the front doors of ordinary Americans. What began as falling numbers on a ticker tape in New York became eviction notices tacked onto farmhouse gates, foreclosure, signs planted on suburban lawns, and the hollow echo of locked bank doors in towns across the nation. The panic of unemployment was bad enough, but when families lost both jobs and savings, the foundation of daily life itself crumbled. Banks, once the pride of American towns, collapsed in staggering numbers. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks closed their doors. People who had entrusted their modest savings to local bankers discovered that, almost overnight, the money no longer existed. There was no safety net, no deposit insurance. The sight of desperate crowds forming outside shuttered banks became a haunting image of the time. Mothers clutching children, fathers demanding answers, and clerks helplessly explaining that the vaults were empty. Trust, so essential to financial systems, was gone, and without trust, the economy withered further. For families, the loss was not just financial, but existential. Without jobs, without savings, they could no longer pay rent or mortgages. Eviction became commonplace. Belongings were piled onto sidewalks, beds and chairs strapped to wagons. Children trailing behind with small bundles in their arms. Whole neighborhoods emptied out, especially in rural America, where drought and dust storms compounded the disaster. The Dust Bowl migrants, fleeing both environmental ruin and economic collapse, filled the highways, heading west in search of fields that might still yield work in cities. The crisis took a different form. Soup kitchens, once rare, multiplied with astonishing speed. Churches, charities, and sometimes even wealthy individuals opened their doors to feed the hungry. Long lines of gaunt men in tattered coats stretched for blocks, waiting patiently. 4 bowls of thin soup and hunks of bread. For many, these meals were the only thing standing between them and starvation. The photographs of these lines, quiet yet endless, became some of the most enduring symbols of the Depression. And yet, even here, human dignity fought to survive. People tried to dress neatly, even for the soup line, refusing to surrender entirely to despair. Some joked quietly as they waited, trying to disguise humiliation with humor. Others prayed silently, hoping that the hardship would pass. There was resilience in the very act of standing together, bowl in hand, refusing to vanish. Meanwhile, movie theaters continued to glow as small sanctuaries in the darkness. For the price of a few cents, a family could sit in the warmth, watch Mickey Mouse bounce across the screen, and laugh together. It was a strange juxtaposition. On one side of the street, soup lines stretched under gray skies. On the other side, posters promised joy, color, and music. Walt Disney himself often said that laughter was essential during those years, and perhaps that is why his characters thrived. When reality offered nothing but fear, imagination became nourishment. The collapse of banks, the loss of homes, and the rise of soup kitchens turned the Great Depression into more than an economic event. It became a psychological wound, reshaping how Americans saw themselves and their country. The myth of endless progress was broken. In its place grew a harsher but more grounded understanding that prosperity was fragile, that security could vanish, and that survival often required community, resilience, and creativity. When we look at America in 2025, the parallels are not exact, but the echoes remain. Today, stock markets break records, and GDP rises faster than expected. Yet beneath the numbers, many families still live paycheck to paycheck, worried about housing costs, medical bills, or the instability of jobs. It does not take a crash to expose fragility, only takes the wrong spark. The lesson of the early 1930s is that when institutions falter, it is ordinary families who feel the shock most deeply. But even then, in the darkest years, hope did not die. It appeared in the resilience of families sharing what little they had, in the hands ladling soup to strangers, and in the laughter that echoed from movie theaters where a little mouse grinned and whistled. History teaches us that despair is real, but so is endurance, and often it is from the tension between the two that new beginnings emerge. In times of crisis, people look instinctively to their leaders, hoping for a steady hand, a reassuring voice, or at least a plan that offers relief. But in the early 1930s, the voice that came from the White House was hesitant, cautious, and often out of tune with the desperation spreading through the country. President Herbert Hoover, a man once celebrated as the great humanitarian for his work feeding Europe after World War I, found himself overwhelmed by the scale of the Depression at home. His instincts leaned toward restraint, and his philosophy clung to the belief that the economy if left alone, would correct itself. Hoover's words, intended to calm, often felt hollow to those in breadlines. He urged patience, reminding Americans that prosperity is just around the corner. To the millions standing in soup kitchen queues, corners seemed endless. His administration tried measures cutting taxes, encouraging businesses to maintain wages, even creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to banks and railroads. But these steps felt distant, indirect, and far too slow. Aid, when it came, trickled rather than flowed, and for families facing eviction or hunger, it was scarcely noticed. The discontent began to grow visible. Protesters marched with signs demanding work, not charity. Veterans of the Great War, promised bonuses to be paid in the future, gathered in Washington as the bonus army, setting up camps to demand their money early. When Hoover ordered the camps cleared, the sight of veterans being driven away by troops shocked the nation and further eroded confidence in his leadership. Too many, it seemed as though the government had turned its back on the very people who had once fought for it. The political atmosphere thickened with frustration. Newspapers that once celebrated prosperity now carried bitter editorials. Cartoons mocked Hoover's promises, portraying him as aloof and detached from the struggles of ordinary people. Around kitchen tables, families muttered that the president lived in a world far removed from their own. Trust in institutions continued to crumble, and the sense that America was adrift without a captain grew stronger. And yet, even in this bleak landscape, the hunger for hope found outlets in unexpected places. For some, it was the arrival of community, organizations and local charities stepping in where the federal government hesitated. For others, it was the escape of movies where Mickey Mouse's laughter felt more responsive than any speech from Washington. The contrast was striking. A cartoon mouse could lift spirits in minutes, while official policies took months to reach those in need. The hesitation of Hoover's administration highlights a truth that stretches across eras in times of upheaval. Delay itself can deepen despair. Economic numbers may eventually recover, but the trust of people, once lost, is harder to restore. In 2025, when markets soar and leaders debate whether to cut interest rates, the echo of Hoover lingers, a reminder that the public does not measure leadership by charts and forecasts alone, but by how swiftly and directly it responds to real fear. By 1932, discontent had hardened into anger. The election year loomed, and the nation yearned for a new voice, one that would not tell them prosperity was around the corner, but that it could be fought for, built, and reclaimed. Hoover, bound by his philosophy, could not shift. His hesitation became the measure of his presidency, and in the shadow of unemployment and hunger, America began to turn toward another man who promised something bold, something new. And so the stage was set for one of the most dramatic political shifts in American history, the rise of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But before that turning point, the despair of Hoover's America had already reshaped the national psyche. It taught Americans that optimism without action is merely noise, and that hesitation in a storm can feel like abandonment. Meanwhile, Walt Disney continued to press forward in his own quiet way. He could not feed the hungry or restore the banks, but he could offer something Washington could not: a sense of joy, a reminder that even in chaos, laughter remained possible. Sometimes, history suggests the mouse is mightier than the president. By the time the election of 1932 approached, the United States was a nation exhausted. Unemployment hovered near 25%. Banks had failed by the thousands, and breadlines had become as common in the cityscape as lampposts. The air carried not only hunger, but also a gnawing sense that the old promise of America prosperity, stability, opportunity, had broken. Into this atmosphere of despair stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a patrician voice with a common touch, offering a message that contrasted sharply with Herbert Hoover's restrained optimism. Roosevelt did not deny the depth of the crisis. He acknowledged the pain, the hunger, the fear, and in doing so, he captured the trust of millions who were weary of being told that prosperity was just around the corner. His campaign promised a New Deal for the American people, a phrase vague enough to inspire countless interpretations, but clear enough to signal change. He spoke of action, bold and persistent, rather than patience. Where Hoover hesitated, Roosevelt radiated confidence that something could be done. The rallies of 1932 glowed with that fragile but vital commodity, hope. Farmers, bankrupt and dust-covered, cheered his pledges. Factory workers, idle for years, clung to his words. Families who had lost homes listened to his voice on the radio and dared to imagine that the government might finally stand with them. Roosevelt's speeches, calm yet forceful, carried a rhythm that felt less like policy and more like reassurance. He promised not certainty, but effort. Not perfection, but struggle. And in the depth of despair, that was enough. When the votes were counted, the verdict was decisive. Roosevelt carried 42 states, sweeping into office with one of the most lopsided victories in American history. For Hoover, it was the bitter end. For the nation, it was a new beginning. Crowds gathered in the streets not just to celebrate an election, but to exhale relief, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Of course, Roosevelt did not possess a magic wand. The Depression would not end overnight. But his inauguration, in March 1933, carried symbolism as powerful as any policy. In his first inaugural address, he declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," a line that became a mantra for a generation battered by uncertainty. For Americans, who had lived through years of economic freefall, those words were more than rhetoric. They were a promise that despair would not have the last word. And as Roosevelt began to experiment with public works programs, bank reforms, and social safety nets, the New Deal took shape. Its success was uneven, its controversies fierce, but its effect undeniable. The government had stepped off the sidelines and entered the fight. For the first time in years, ordinary Americans felt that someone in power was not merely urging patience, but taking action in those same years. Walt Disney's own journey mirrored that spirit of resilience. His studio, small and precarious, continued to grow, buoyed by the laughter of audiences who needed escape. While Roosevelt promised a New Deal, Disney delivered a different kind of deal. A bargain of joy in exchange for a nickel ticket. Both in their own way offered hope. The election of 1932 was not the end of the Depression, but it was the turning of the tide. It showed that, even in the darkest winters, leadership and imagination could rekindle belief. It proved that hope, once ignited, can spread faster than despair, and perhaps, as we reflect from the vantage of 2025. With stock markets at dizzying highs and yet uncertainty humming beneath the surface, we are reminded that crises demand more than patience. They demand courage, vision, and creativity. Just as Roosevelt's New Deal and Disney's Mouse carried America through its darkest days, so too might our own age find its unlikely heroes when shadows lengthen. For now, let us pause at this moment. In 1932, when a broken nation turned toward a new voice, and remember that even in the deepest valleys, light can appear. And if you're still awake with me on this journey, leave a 1 in the comments. It's always heartening to know who's still here, walking together through the long corridors of history. Before Mickey Mouse, before Hollywood, before the empire of theme parks and princess castles, Walt Disney was just a young man in Kansas City with a stubborn dream and very little else. In the early 1920s, he launched a small animation business he called La Fogram Studios. The name itself was hopeful. Laugh and telegram fused into a promise that joy could be delivered like a message, quickly and directly. But the reality behind the cheerful name was far less secure. Walt was still in his early 20s, restless, ambitious, and convinced that animation could be more than a novelty. Kansas City was not exactly the center of the entertainment world, but it had enough small theaters to provide him with a modest audience. With a handful of employees, he began producing short animated cartoons, often whimsical takes on fairy tales. These were charming, clever, and innovative for their time. Local audiences enjoyed them, and for a brief moment, it looked as though Le Faugram might succeed. But dreams cost money, and Walt had very little of it. His studio operated on thin margins, constantly borrowing to cover expenses. Contracts were unreliable, payments arrived late, and distributors often exploited young animators who lacked legal savvy. Walt paid his employees as best he could, sometimes handing over money he barely had, sometimes delaying wages in the hope of better days. Optimism was abundant. Cash was not. The collapse came quickly. By 1923, debts piled too high, and distributors withheld crucial payments. Employees, loyal but hungry, could not wait forever. Walt, who had been skipping meals to keep the studio alive, finally faced the inevitable. Le Faugram was bankrupt. At 21 years old, he found himself broke. His studio shuttered, his dreams seemingly shattered. He even lived for a short time in the office, sleeping on a cot, bathing at the train station, and eating what little he could scavenge. Most would have quit. For many, such a failure at such a young age would have been enough to send them into safer work, perhaps as an illustrator or a commercial artist. But Walt's stubbornness bordered on defiance. The collapse of Le Faugram did not end his vision, it clarified it. Kansas City was too small, too limited. If animation had a future, it would be in California, where the movie industry was booming, and the infrastructure for distribution was far greater. And so, with almost nothing in his pocket, Walt boarded a train to Los Angeles, carrying little more than his drawings and his determination. In hindsight, the failure of Le Faugram was essential. It stripped away illusions, forced Walt to confront the ruthlessness of the industry, and taught him lessons about ownership and contracts that would later shape his career. Had he succeeded in Kansas City, he might have remained a small-town animator, producing shorts for local theaters. Instead, failure pushed him west, toward the stage where Mickey and his empire would eventually be born. The story carries an echo for us in 2025. In an age of startups and tech dreams, failure is often spoken of as a stepping stone, a badge of honor, yet in the moment, failure feels like despair. For Walt, sleeping in his office, broke and hungry, there was no guarantee of future success. But what separated him was persistence, the refusal to let failure be final. In a sense, his story mirrors the broader theme of the Great Depression itself. Collapse can destroy, but it can also create the conditions for reinvention. When Americans in the 1930s faced bank failures and job losses, many found themselves, like Walt in 1923, stripped of security, clinging to scraps, forced to imagine a new path. Some gave up, some endured quietly, and a few reinvented themselves in ways that reshaped the world. Walt's collapse in Kansas City, years before the Depression, was a rehearsal for resilience. It showed that out of bankruptcy could come brilliance, and that sometimes the only way forward is through loss. Le Faugram's cheerful name may have ended in silence, but from its ashes rose the determination that would eventually give the world Mickey Mouse, and that, perhaps, is the quiet comfort of history. Failure is rarely the end. Sometimes it is simply the dark room before the curtain rises. When Walt Disney boarded the train westward in 1923, leaving behind the ruins of Le Faugram Studios, he carried little more than a suitcase, a few drawings, and an oversized ambition. California was not yet the global entertainment capital it would become, but Hollywood already pulsed with opportunity. Silent films filled theaters, studios churned out melodramas and comedies, and a new generation of entrepreneurs were building empires out of celluloid. Walt hoped he might carve out his own corner of that world, even if he arrived with almost nothing in his pockets. In Los Angeles, he teamed up with his brother Roy, whose steady, practical nature balanced Walt's restless imagination. Together, they founded the Disney Brothers studio in a small rented office. At first, their work was modest, short silent cartoons that combined live action and animation, often featuring a character named Alice who interacted with animated creatures. These Alice comedies were inventive but produced on shoestring, budgets barely enough to keep the studio alive. Walt drew and directed. Roy managed the books and negotiated deals. It was survival, not success. Yet even in those lean years, Walt's drive to innovate never waned. He wanted more than to amuse. He wanted to transform the medium. In 1927, he created a new character, Oswald, the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was clever, energetic, and expressive in ways that suggested a new maturity for animation. Distributed through Universal Pictures, the Oswald shorts found genuine popularity. And for the first time, Walt felt as though he had something stable. The rabbit was not just a character, he was a lifeline. But Hollywood had its own rules, and they were often brutal. In 1928, during a trip to New York to negotiate for higher budgets, Walt learned the harsh reality of contracts he had signed in haste. Oswald did not belong to him. Universal Pictures held the rights, and Charles Mintz, the distributor, had already persuaded most of Disney's animators to defect. Mintz delivered the ultimatum: accept lower payments and lose independence, or walk away with nothing. Walt walked away. It was a devastating blow. On the train ride back to California, with his studio on the verge of collapse, he was forced to face the fact that he had lost nearly everything again, as he had in Kansas City. Only this time, the betrayal cut deeper, because it came at the moment when success seemed within reach. For Roy, it meant financial disaster. For Walt, it meant humiliation and fury. For their employees, it meant uncertainty, as the future of the studio hung in the balance. Yet it was in this moment of despair that reinvention stirred. Walt began sketching ideas during that train ride, searching for a new character who could replace Oswald. He wanted something simple, yet expressive, lovable, yet resilient. Out of these sketches emerged a mouse, small, round, and cheerful. He would name him Mickey. The irony could not have been sharper. Just as the walls of Walt's career collapsed, the seed of his greatest creation appeared. This betrayal taught Walt lessons that would shape the rest of his life. He resolved never again to lose control of his creations. In the years that followed, Disney became fiercely protective of intellectual property, ensuring that Mickey and all who followed would remain firmly under his company's ownership. In a sense, the theft of Oswald built the foundation for Disney's later empire, for it instilled a discipline as strong as his imagination. The story feels uncannily familiar in 2025. In our own age, young entrepreneurs launch startups with dazzling ideas, only to discover that venture capital contracts or corporate buyouts leave them stripped of the very creations they built. Like Walt, many learn too late that control can vanish in fine print. And yet, as Disney's journey shows, loss can be the crucible of creativity. Oswald's theft did not end. Walt's story forced him to imagine Mickey, who would change the world. By the time he stepped off the train in Los Angeles, Walt had lost his rabbit, but gained his resolve. The silent beginnings in Hollywood, the fragile Alice comedies, the fleeting success of Oswald, all of it had led to this, the birth of a mouse who would carry both Walt and America through years of hardship. What looked like defeat was, In hindsight, the turning point, when Walt Disney returned from New York in 1928, stripped of Oswald and nearly stripped of hope, the future of his studio looked grim. But out of that bitterness, he and his small team began shaping the character who would rescue them. The mouse he sketched on the train, playful, resilient, mischievous, quickly became the center of their efforts. They named him Mickey, and though he was born from desperation, he carried a cheerfulness that felt indestructible. The challenge was not only to design a character, but to present him in a way that would astonish audiences. By then, silent animation was already beginning to look dated. Movies with synchronized sound had burst onto the scene. The jazz singer in 1927 had electrified audiences with the simple phrase, "You ain't heard nothing yet." Walt knew that if Mickey was going to succeed, he had to ride this new wave of sound. And so, with resources painfully thin, Disney's team poured their energy into an audacious experiment, Steamboat Willie. The premise was simple enough: a mouse steering a steamboat, whistling merrily, and creating slapstick chaos with animals and kitchen utensils. But the genius lay in the synchronization. Every whistle, every squeak, every bang of a pot was perfectly timed with the action on screen. To modern ears, it might seem quaint, but to audiences in November 1928, it was nothing short of magical. For the first time, a cartoon character truly seemed alive, not a silent sketch, but a creature with voice, rhythm, and spirit. Walt bet everything on this short. He borrowed money, stretched his animators to exhaustion, and risked his fragile studio on the gamble that sound would transform the industry. When Steamboat Willie premiered at the Colony Theater in New York, the gamble paid off spectacularly. The audience roared with laughter, clapped in rhythm with Mickey's whistle, and left the theater buzzing. Reviewers praised the innovation, calling it a new art form. Almost overnight, Mickey Mouse became a star. For Walt, the relief was immense. He had been betrayed, bankrupted, humiliated, but with one 7-minute cartoon, he had turned failure into triumph. Mickey's success not only saved the studio, but gave Disney the foundation to dream bigger. More shorts followed, each refining the character, expanding his personality, and embedding him deeper into American culture. By 1929, Mickey was not merely a cartoon. He was a cultural icon, appearing in newspapers, merchandise, and even the popular imagination. What made Mickey resonate so strongly was not just the novelty of sound, but the timing of his arrival. In 1928 and early 1929, America was still basking in the glow of prosperity. The economy appeared unstoppable, and Mickey's cheerful whistle mirrored that mood. Yet when the crash came later in 1929, Mickey did not fade. Instead, his humor became something else entirely, a coping mechanism. He was optimism personified, a small companion to millions struggling with the shock of unemployment and poverty. Walt once reflected that Mickey was everything he wished he could be: fearless, endlessly cheerful, always finding a way through trouble. In that sense, the mouse embodied not only Walt's resilience, but also America's. When audiences watched Mickey turn chaos into comedy, they were reminded that joy was still possible, even in a world falling apart. Seen from today, Mickey's debut also carries a warning and a comfort. In 2025, as Wall Street once again celebrates record highs, and GDP growth beats expectations, it is easy to believe that prosperity is permanent. But history teaches us how fragile such confidence can be. Just as Mickey arrived on the eve of collapse, today's icons, whether in technology, culture, or finance, may be standing on the edge of upheaval. Yet if Mickey's story teaches anything, it is that even in collapse, creativity can thrive, and symbols of joy can carry people through the darkest of nights. Mickey's birth was not just the creation of a character, it was the invention of resilience, in animated form. He was, in every way, the little mouse that roared against despair. And in the years to come, that roar, disguised as a whistle, would echo through Depression-era America, offering laughter where laughter seemed impossible. Success, in Walt Disney's world, never meant standing still. The triumph of Steamboat Willie had saved his small studio from collapse, but Walt understood that novelty fades quickly. Other studios were already scrambling to imitate synchronized sound, and audiences, ever restless, would soon demand more. To survive, Disney had to stay ahead, not by copying others, but by leaping further than anyone thought possible. Innovation, for him, was not a luxury. It was survival. His first great leap came with color. In 1932, Walt secured the exclusive rights to use a new technology called Technicolor for animation. Until then, most cartoons were black and white, their charm relying on gags and timing rather than visual richness. With Technicolor's 3-strip process, Disney's animators could suddenly flood the screen with hues never before seen in animation. Vivid greens, glowing reds, soft blues. The result was Flowers and Trees, a silly symphony short that debuted. In full color, audiences gasped. Leaves shimmered, flowers danced, and the once flat world of cartoons blossomed into a living palette. The gamble paid off. Flowers and Trees not only delighted viewers, but also won the very first Academy Award ever given for animated short film. It was a milestone that elevated Disney above his competitors and secured his reputation as an innovator. But it also came at a cost. Producing in color was expensive, time-consuming, and risky in a time when the nation's economy was sinking deeper into the Great Depression. Walt, however, believed that quality and imagination would carry the studio forward, even if the balance sheets trembled. Innovation did not stop with color. Disney also pushed for greater depth in storytelling. While many studios relied on formulaic slapstick, Disney insisted that cartoons could carry emotion, character development, even pathos. Shorts like The Three Little Pigs, 1933, showed not only catchy songs, but also narratives that resonated with Depression audiences. The song "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf" became an anthem of resilience, turning a children's tune into a national expression of defiance against hardship. Through these works, Disney proved that animation could be more than fleeting jokes. It could be a form of storytelling that comforted, inspired, and endured. The technical side of this ambition pushed his animators to the edge. He encouraged them to experiment with perspective, to create depth of field, and to make movements more fluid and lifelike. The invention of the multiplane camera, which allowed backgrounds and foregrounds to move at different speeds, gave animation a new sense of realism. With every new short, Disney was not only entertaining, but also stretching the very boundaries of the medium. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of national despair. As breadlines lengthened and unemployment soared, Disney's films offered something more than escape. They offered a glimpse of beauty in a world that felt gray. Audiences who could barely afford necessities still saved a few coins for the theater, because for a brief time, Mickey's Adventures or A Technicolor Forest made them forget their hunger. In this way, innovation became not just survival for Disney's studio, but a form of survival for the audiences as well. There is a lesson in this for us in 2025. Innovation today, whether in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, or medicine, often emerges not from comfort, but from crisis. Just as Disney risked scarce resources in the 1930s to paint his worlds in color, today's entrepreneurs gamble amid economic uncertainty, geopolitical strain, and climate anxiety. The impulse is the same. When the world feels broken, imagination must find new ways to restore wonder. Walt's insistence on pushing boundaries also reflected a deeper truth. Survival is not only about clinging to what you have, but daring to create what does not yet exist. His studio's finances were precarious, yet he invested in experiments others deemed foolish. That stubborn vision would eventually lead him to attempt something even more audacious than color cartoons, the first full-length animated feature. But that was still on the horizon. In the early 1930s, as America staggered through its darkest years, Disney's relentless innovations kept both his studio alive and the public enchanted. Each cartoon was a reminder that imagination could flourish even in barren soil, and each success brought him closer to the dream that would define his legacy. By the mid-1930s, Walt Disney's studio stood at a strange crossroads. On one hand, Mickey Mouse had become a global icon, beloved by children and adults alike. The silly symphonies had brought not only laughter, but also prestige, with Flowers and Trees winning the first Oscar for animated short film. On the surface, Disney's studio looked like a rising star, shimmering even as the Depression cast darkness across the nation. Yet beneath that shimmer lay fragility. The truth was that the studio's finances were constantly on edge. Innovation, Walt's driving. Obsession was expensive. Technicolor rights cost money. The multiplane camera cost money. And each new cartoon required more labor, more skill, more investment. While audiences adored Mickey, the short films did not always generate enough profit to cover the costs of production. Merchandising helped. Mickey's face appeared on everything from school supplies to watches. But the revenue was not yet enough to stabilize the business. Employees felt the strain. Animators worked long hours for modest pay, driven by Walt's perfectionism and restless ambition. Some admired his vision. Others grumbled at the pace and pressure. Walt himself lived in a constant state of tension, balancing creative dreams against financial realities. Roy Disney, ever the pragmatist, struggled to keep the books in order, often clashing with his brother over spending. Where Walt saw the next great innovation, Roy saw the risk of bankruptcy. Their partnership, though strong, was a continual negotiation between imagination and survival. The wider context only deepened the challenge. America in the Depression was a place where luxuries were scarce. Families scraped by on limited incomes, and entertainment, while cheap, was still a discretionary expense. Competing studios could churn out cartoons faster and cheaper, relying on slapstick formulas that cost less than Disney's elaborate productions. More than once, bankers questioned whether Walt's relentless pursuit of quality was sustainable in such hard times, and yet audiences kept coming. Even if a family could not afford new clothes, they might still spend a nickel to laugh at Mickey or marvel at the colors of a silly symphony. Theaters, desperate to fill seats, relied on cartoons to lure audiences, and Disney's shorts became staples before feature films. In this sense, the fragility of the studio mirrored the fragility of America itself, always on the brink. Yet somehow, moving forward, Walt's response to financial strain was not to retreat, but to dream bigger. He began to envision a project that seemed impossible. A full-length animated feature film. It would be a fairy tale, told with the same care as live-action drama, filled with music, emotion, and technicolor brilliance. Colleagues laughed at the idea, calling it Disney's folly. Bankers doubted audiences would sit through an hour of animation. Even his animators worried the studio would collapse under the weight of such ambition. But Walt, true to form, believed that only by daring something extraordinary could the studio truly secure its future. The irony is striking. In the depths of the Great Depression, when businesses were cutting costs and playing safe, Disney doubled down on risk. His fragile studio, already stretched thin, would wager everything on a film about a young princess, 7 dwarfs, and the triumph of innocence. Failure would mean ruin. Success would change everything, seen from 2025. It is tempting to view this gamble as inevitable genius, but at the time, it looked reckless. And yet, history shows that fragility and ambition often walk together. Just as America's despair fueled political innovation in the form of the New Deal, so too did economic fragility drive artistic innovation in Disney's world. Out of the thin margins of survival came the determination to attempt something no one else dared. The studio in the 1930s was a fragile house built on dreams, one gust away from collapse, but it stood because Walt refused to stop building. His story in those years reminds us that survival is not just about holding on, it is about imagining more, even when the world insists you cannot. And if you're still awake, leave a 1 in the comments. It's comforting to know who's walking this long road of history with us, through the fragile years when even a mouse had to fight to survive. By 1933, America had sunk into the deepest shadows of the Depression. What had begun as a sudden crash on Wall Street had by now hardened into daily reality for millions. Unemployment reached an astonishing 25%, a quarter of the workforce idle, a figure so stark it defied imagination. In practical terms, it meant that in nearly every family, someone, often several, were without jobs. The hum of factories slowed to silence, the clang of construction sites fell quiet, and entire towns seemed frozen, waiting for an economic spring that never arrived. The despair was not confined to numbers. It was visible in the weary eyes of men who once took pride in steady wages but now drifted aimlessly in search of work. Newspapers carried stories of engineers taking odd jobs, sweeping streets, of teachers lining up for day labor, of skilled craftsmen reduced to begging. Women stretched meager groceries into meals that could feed children, but left little for themselves. Families patched clothes until they were little more than rags, holding them together with stubbornness as much as with thread. The protests began quietly, but grew louder as the years dragged on. Hungry crowds marched with placards demanding work, not charity. Farmers, crushed by falling crop prices and debt, organized strikes, sometimes blocking highways to stop produce from reaching markets where it would sell for pennies. In cities, demonstrations turned tense. Police were called, tempers flared, and the discontent that simmered beneath the surface erupted in angry voices. For many, patience had run out. The government's responses often lagged behind, and in that gap between suffering and relief, despair grew. Some turned to radical politics, socialist, or even communist movements gained followers. Not because ideology had suddenly taken root, but because hunger and hopelessness made alternatives appealing. Others placed their faith in local communities, where neighbors pooled resources, shared food, and created makeshift safety nets. Across the country, resilience took the form of quiet acts: a loaf of bread shared, a child's shoes mended, a barn rebuilt by friends. The psychological toll was profound. To be unemployed was not simply to lack money, was to lose dignity, purpose, and identity. Letters to newspapers described fathers walking the streets all day, searching for work, only to return home ashamed and silent. One journalist at the time wrote that the Depression was not only an economic crisis, but a spiritual one, for it stripped people of the belief that tomorrow would be better than today. And yet, even in this darkness, sparks of defiance glimmered. When protests filled city squares, the chants were not merely of anger, but of demand for a fairer future. When farmers blocked roads, it was not nihilism, but a stubborn insistence that their labor had value. And in theaters across the nation, audiences still gathered for escape. For a nickel, they could laugh at Mickey Mouse, who whistled his way through trouble, as if to remind them that chaos could be turned into comedy. The irony was not lost on some. At a time when the president himself struggled to restore confidence, a cartoon mouse often did a better job. While banks shut their doors, Mickey opened his arms. While unemployment lines grew, he danced and whistled. He could not fill empty stomachs, but he could fill weary hearts with laughter, and sometimes that was enough to carry people through another day. Looking back from 2025, the images of that era feel hauntingly familiar. Today, official statistics may not show such staggering unemployment, but the unease is similar. Beneath record stock prices and GDP growth, many workers worry about automation, layoffs, or entire industries vanishing overnight. The anxiety of instability still echoes across kitchens and paychecks, just as it did in the 1930s. The lesson remains: prosperity can vanish quickly, but so too can resilience appear where it is least expected. By the mid-1930s, America was a nation of protests and despair, but also of quiet endurance. Out of that tension, political change and cultural creation began to flourish. And as Walt Disney watched from his fragile studio in California, he understood what so many others did, that the only way to survive was to imagine something larger than despair. In the depths of the Depression, when breadlines snaked around, city blocks and families bartered belongings to buy food, one might have expected the movie theaters to fall silent. After all, what place could entertainment have in a world where even necessities were scarce? Yet the opposite happened. Hollywood discovered a paradox that astonished economists and reassured producers. While nearly everything else declined in the 1930s, cinema attendance remained stubbornly high. For the price of a nickel or a dime, families could step into a darkened theater and, for a few hours, leave behind the weight of hunger and debt. Theaters became sanctuaries, almost chapels of escape, where laughter and music replaced worry. Parents who could not afford new shoes for their children still saved coins for a Saturday matinee, reasoning that joy was worth as much as bread. In those years, entertainment was not frivolity, was survival of the spirit. Hollywood, sensing this, leaned into the role. Studios gambled big on spectacle, on musicals with dazzling costumes, on romances that promised happy endings, and on comedies that turned hardship into humor. Audiences did not want to be reminded of their misery. They wanted to believe, at least for a while, that the world could still be beautiful. Films like 42nd Street and Gold Diggers of 1933 overflowed with songs of resilience and choreographies that sparkled with optimism. In their own way, they were as much medicine as art. And nestled within this cinematic boom was Walt Disney, whose cartoons carried a special kind of magic. Mickey Mouse shorts played before feature films, and audiences greeted him as an old friend. His whistle, his mischief, his refusal to be discouraged by chaos, these qualities resonated deeply in a time when discouragement was everywhere. Other studios produced cartoons too, but none carried quite the same blend of innocence and resilience. Mickey did not mock hardship, he danced through it. That made him different, and that difference made him beloved. The paradox of depression. Cinema also reflected a broader truth. When reality grows unbearable, people cling to imagination more fiercely. Theaters filled even as homes emptied, because the human need for hope is not less than the need for food. This was Hollywood's gamble, and it paid off. By 1935, weekly movie attendance in America reached nearly 80 million, a staggering number, in a nation of 125 million people. In other words, nearly two-thirds of Americans were going to the movies every week, despite poverty pressing at their doors. This paradox was not lost on observers. Social critics of the time wondered aloud whether Americans were deceiving themselves, escaping into fantasy while the world outside collapsed. But others argued that this very escape kept the nation from collapsing entirely. A well-timed laugh, a touching story, or a cheerful mouse whistling on a steamboat could do more for morale than a dozen government pamphlets. The lesson, once again, feels familiar today. In 2025, streaming platforms, social media, and digital entertainment thrive even in moments of economic anxiety. People may cancel vacations or postpone large purchases, but but they rarely cancel Netflix. The instinct remains the same. When life feels unstable, imagination becomes a lifeline. The Depression-era theaters remind us that entertainment is not trivial. It is the space where collective despair is suspended and collective hope rehearsed. Hollywood's gamble in the 1930s, spending money to dazzle a nation in poverty, looked reckless at first glance. But it was, in fact, shrewd. By feeding imaginations, studios fed resilience, and in the process, they discovered that even in economic ruin, people will still pay for dreams. For Walt Disney, this paradox was crucial. Without depression, audiences crowding theaters, his fragile studio might have withered. Instead, their hunger for joy sustained him, giving Mickey Mouse not only a stage, but also a purpose. In a way, every ticket purchased was a small vote of confidence, not just in entertainment, but in the belief that despair could be interrupted by wonder. And so, as the nation stumbled deeper into hardship, Hollywood's gamble proved that escape was not denial, it was medicine. At the end of a week spent, jobless, hungry, or fearful, the sound of laughter in a theater was proof that the spirit had not surrendered. And somewhere in that laughter, in the whistle of a mouse, and the sparkle of Technicolor, America rehearsed the possibility of better days. By the mid-1930s, even as Mickey Mouse and the Silly Symphonies had secured Walt Disney a place in America's cultural imagination, the studio remained fragile. Shorts kept the doors open, but they did not guarantee lasting stability. Walt, restless as ever, looked beyond them. To him, animation was not a sideshow before the main feature, it could be the main feature. He began to dream of something no one else dared attempt, a full-length animated motion picture. The idea seemed absurd. Cartoons were seen as novelty, little bursts of laughter before the real film began. Audiences loved Mickey, yes, but would they sit through 90 minutes of animation? Distributors scoffed. Bankers shook their heads. Even Disney's own animators muttered doubts in the studio halls. The project quickly earned a nickname around Hollywood, Disney's Folly. Walt ignored the laughter. He was convinced that animation could carry not just gags, but emotion, drama, and beauty. He envisioned a film that would blend music, color, and story into an immersive fairy tale, one that would make audiences laugh, cry, and believe. The story he chose was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. On the surface, it was a simple children's tale. But in Walt's hands it became something more. An allegory of innocence surviving hardship, of light emerging from darkness. Perhaps he chose it subconsciously because it mirrored the Depression. Itself, the scale of the project was staggering. Thousands of drawings were needed for every few minutes of film. Animators had to learn new techniques for character depth and emotional expression. Backgrounds were painted in layers, filmed with the multiplane camera to create a sense of space and realism. For the first time, cartoon characters would not simply tumble and pratfall. They would sigh, weep, and love. The cost spiraled. At a time when studios were tightening budgets, Disney poured everything into the project. What had begun as a modest budget of $250,000 ballooned to nearly $1.5 million, a fortune in Depression dollars. Roy Disney, tasked with finding financing, nearly tore his hair out. The brothers mortgaged the studio's future, borrowing heavily, risking collapse if the film failed. For animators, the pressure was relentless. They worked late into the night, refining expressions, testing sequences, redrawing entire scenes when Walt demanded perfection. Skeptics sharpened their knives. Hollywood insiders whispered that the project would ruin Disney. Theater owners doubted anyone would pay to see a cartoon fairy tale. Some even predicted that audiences would become dizzy, that their eyes would not endure such a long immersion in moving drawings. To many, Disney's Folly was not just a nickname, it was a prophecy. But Walt was not deterred. He believed that in a time of despair, people longed for wonder. He believed that the Depression had not destroyed the hunger for beauty, but had deepened it. If anything, hardship made imagination more necessary. Snow White, with her kindness and resilience, was the heroine the age needed. The dwarfs, with their quirks and humor, were companions for weary audiences. The story's dark forest and wicked queen mirrored the anxiety of the era, while its ultimate triumph promised that innocence could outlast cruelty. Looking back from 2025, the audacity of Walt's vision feels prophetic. Today, we are accustomed to animated blockbusters dominating the box office, but in the mid-1930s, the idea was lunacy. It was as risky as betting a fortune on a new technology or launching a startup in the middle of a recession. Yet history shows that great leaps often appear foolish at first. Innovation wears the disguise of folly until it proves itself. The Depression was filled with caution. Businesses cutting costs, families saving scraps, governments hesitant to act boldly. But Walt Disney chose the opposite path. He leaned into risk, trusting that audiences wanted not just distraction, but wonder on a scale they had never seen before. That gamble, still incomplete in the mid-1930s, would soon transform the studio, the industry, and the world's understanding of what animation could be. And so Disney's folly advanced, fueled by stubbornness, debt, and imagination. In the workshops of his studio, weary animators labored under flickering lamps, drawing frame after frame of dwarfs whistling in mines and Snow White dreaming by a well. They were not just making a film, they were building a new art form, brick by fragile brick. In the middle of the nation's darkest decade, the dream of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was luminous, but its making was anything but easy. Behind the cheerful songs and shimmering colors lay a grueling reality of debt, exhaustion, and doubt. The Disney studio in the mid-1930s was less a factory of joy than a crucible, where animators, technicians, and musicians poured out long hours, in pursuit of a vision many feared might destroy them. Financing remained a constant headache, as costs soared past $1 million, a staggering figure in the midst of the Depression. Roy Disney fought endless battles with bankers. He negotiated loans, extended credit, and mortgaged nearly everything the brothers owned. Each new expense threatened collapse. Hollywood insiders mocked them, whispering that the studio would never recover. That Walt's obsession was dragging everyone into ruin. Even some employees wondered if they were gambling their livelihoods on a fool's errand. The strain on the workforce was immense. Animators toiled deep into the night, often collapsing at their desks. The new techniques Walt demanded faces, realistic movements, subtle emotions, thousands upon thousands of extra drawings. Entire sequences were scrapped and redone when Walt felt they lacked heart. He was not cruel, but he was relentless, insisting that the audience must believe Snow White was real, that the dwarfs must feel alive, that the story must not only amuse, but move. To meet these demands, the studio became a place of sacrifice. Wives complained their husbands were never home. Young artists gave up weekends, sketching dwarfs until their hands cramped. Musicians replayed songs endlessly, refining melodies that would one day echo through generations. For many, the pay barely compensated the exhaustion, but loyalty to Walt's vision kept them at their desks. He had a gift for persuading others that they were not just drawing cartoons, they were making history. Yet doubt lingered. Some animators whispered that audiences would never accept a feature-length cartoon, that the public would laugh, or, worse, grow bored. Others feared the studio's debts would crush them regardless of the film's quality. Walt himself, though outwardly confident, wrestled with anxiety. He had bet everything his studio, his reputation, his family's future on the success of this film. If Snow White failed, there would be no recovery. The irony was sharp. As America staggered through unemployment and hunger, the Disney studio endured its own miniature depression. Certainty, sacrifice, fear of collapse. Yet just as the nation sought hope in Roosevelt's New Deal, so too did the Disney team cling to the hope that their work might deliver a different kind of salvation. Joy. There were moments of triumph, even amid the strain. When early test screenings of completed sequences drew gasps and tears from small audiences, morale lifted. Animators who had doubted felt renewed when they saw Snow White's face move with genuine emotion, or when the dwarfs sang with humor and warmth. It was proof that their sleepless nights were not wasted, that something extraordinary was taking shape. The studio's struggle resonates with us in 2025. Innovation, today whether in technology, science, or art, still demands this mixture of strain and sacrifice. Behind every dazzling breakthrough lies a team stretched thin, working under pressure, doubting themselves, yet pushing forward. The Depression years remind us that resilience is often born not in ease, but in exhaustion, when the only choice is to keep going or collapse. For Walt, the sacrifices of his team were both a burden and a blessing. He carried the weight of knowing how much they risked alongside him. Their doubts mirrored his own, but their persistence gave him strength. Together, they turned fear into fuel. The film moved forward, inch by inch, drawing by drawing, until the dream that had once been mocked as Disney's folly began to look like destiny. And so, in the flickering light of overworked lamps, through the scratch of pencils and the hum of cameras, Snow White slowly came to life. She was born not just of imagination, but of sacrifice to sleepless nights of animators, the borrowed dollars of bankers, the unyielding will of a man who refused to accept failure. What the world would soon see as magic was, in truth, the product of doubt endured and exhaustion transformed into beauty. On a cold December evening in 1937, the gamble that had nearly bankrupted Walt Disney stepped into the spotlight. The Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles glittered with searchlights as limousines rolled up, delivering stars, critics, and curious onlookers to the premiere of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. For months, Hollywood had scoffed at the project, dismissing it as Disney's folly. Tonight would decide whether Walt's dream would be remembered as genius or ruin. Inside the theater, as the lights dimmed and the opening credits rolled, nervous tension filled the air. Walt sat among the audience, outwardly calm, but inwardly anxious. He had risked everything: money borrowed, mortgages signed, reputations staked. If the audience grew restless or bored, if laughter turned to ridicule, the Disney studio would collapse. His animators, exhausted from years of relentless work, would be left jobless. His family's sacrifices would be in vain. The stakes were immense, but as the story unfolded, the mood changed. The audience laughed at the dwarfs' antics, gasped at the Queen's transformation, and fell silent during Snow White's poisoned sleep. When the dwarfs mourned her in the candlelit cottage, some in the audience wept openly. These were hardened critics, seasoned stars, men and women not prone to sentimentality, yet here they sat, moved to tears by animated drawings. And when the final kiss awakened Snow White, and the film closed with its radiant happily ever after, the theater erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, cheering, as if they had witnessed not just a film, but a revelation. The verdict was undeniable. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was a triumph. Far from a folly, it was a masterpiece that redefined what cinema could be. Within weeks, box office numbers confirmed the victory. The film earned millions, becoming the highest-grossing sound film up to that time. At a moment when America was still clawing its way out of despair, audiences lined up around blocks to see Snow White's story of innocence, danger, and redemption. For children, it was enchantment. For adults, it was hope disguised as fairy tale. For Walt, the success was overwhelming. He wept quietly after the premiere, not only from relief, but from sheer exhaustion. Years of sacrifice, doubt, and ridicule had finally paid off. The profits from Snow White cleared the studio's debts, funded a new state-of-the-art facility in Burbank, and gave the Disney brothers the stability they had long craved. What had once seemed like madness had become the foundation of an empire. The cultural impact was equally profound. Snow White proved that animation was not a sideshow but a legitimate art form, capable of carrying depth, emotion, and grandeur, equal to live-action films. It opened the door to a new era of storytelling, one in which imagination was not limited by the physical world, but expanded by the boundless creativity of drawings brought to life. In the dark years of the Depression, Snow White became more than a princess. She was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even poisoned sleep could end in awakening. And in that sense, Snow White belonged not only to Walt Disney, but to the millions who saw themselves in her struggle. Audiences who trudged through breadlines and counted pennies saw reflected on the screen a world of darkness pierced by light, cruelty defeated by innocence, despair answered with hope. The film's magic was not escapism alone. It was the promise that even in times of suffering, beauty and wonder could still emerge. Looking from 2025, the echoes linger. Today, amid record stock markets and headlines of prosperity, there remains an undercurrent of uneased geopolitical tension, fragile supply chains, the quiet worry of what lies beneath the numbers. Snow White reminds us that when collapse threatens, creativity can still produce miracles, and what the world dismisses as folly may yet change everything. On that December night in 1937, Walt Disney transformed doubt into applause, exhaustion into enchantment, and fragility into fortune. Out of depression's darkness, he conjured light. And for audiences then, and for us now, the lesson is the same. Despair is never the final chapter. And if you're still awake, leave a 1 in the comments. It's heartening to know who's still here, journeying with us through the long corridors of history, where even a fairy tale can carry the weight of a nation's hope. The success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs did more than dazzle. Audiences' hit transformed the destiny of Walt Disney and his fragile studio. For years, the company had teetered on the edge of collapse, scraping by on Mickey shorts and silly symphonies, borrowing endlessly to finance Disney's folly. Now, in a matter of months, the tide turned. The film earned over $8 million worldwide during its first release, a staggering figure in the 1930s, when nickels and dimes were carefully rationed. At a time when the nation was still clawing its way out of depression, this single animated fairy tale became not just profitable, but historic. The profits did what years of struggle could not. Debts were cleared, bankers silenced, and the Disney studio finally stood on solid ground. Mortgages that had haunted Roy were paid off. Creditors who had doubted Walt's vision were repaid with interest. For the first time since the collapsed in Kansas City, Walt could breathe without the weight of looming bankruptcy. The relief was immense, but it was not in Walt's nature to simply rest. Instead, he looked ahead, convinced that the triumph of Snow White was only the beginning. One of the first tangible results was the construction of a new studio. The cramped quarters in Hyperion Avenue, where animators had worked late into the night in poorly lit rooms, were no longer enough. With Snow White's revenue, Walt commissioned a state-of-the-art facility in Burbank, designed specifically for animation. Unlike the makeshift offices of the past, this studio was expansive, modern, and filled with the latest technology. Spacious animation rooms, screening theaters, sound stages, and workshops for music and effects all were included, making it one of the most advanced creative spaces in the world. For the animators who had endured years of exhaustion, the new studio felt like a reward. The cramped hot rooms of Hyperion gave way to airy, well-lit spaces. Instead of borrowing equipment, they now had custom tools. There was even a cafeteria and recreational areas, reflecting Walt's belief that creativity thrived best when artists felt cared for. To work at Disney was no longer to endure fragility. It was to stand inside a fortress built on imagination. The financial success also emboldened Walt to invest in projects that had once seemed unthinkable. No longer limited by fear of bankruptcy, he began to plan new full-length features: Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi. Each would push the boundaries of animation further, each would risk more, and each would be funded by the foundation Snow White had built. For Walt, the profits were never just money. They were fuel for ambition. Yet the story was not simply about Disney's rise. It was also about the resilience of audiences who had made the film a success. Millions of ordinary Americans, living through economic hardship, had chosen to spend their scarce coins on a ticket to see Snow White. In doing so, they voted for imagination, for beauty, for hope. The film's profits were not conjured from wealth alone, but from sacrifice: nickels saved, dimes set aside, because even in the darkest decade, people refused to surrender their hunger for wonder. Looking back, the success of Snow White stands as one of history's great reminders that crisis does not extinguish creativity. Instead, it sharpens it. The Depression had stripped America bare, but out of that hunger emerged a masterpiece that repaid debts, rebuilt a studio, and launched an empire. And in 2025, the echo is clear. Just as Disney turned scarcity into triumph, innovators today dream of transforming fragile beginnings into empires. The profits of imagination, whether in film, technology, or art, are never measured only in dollars. They are measured in endurance, in resilience, in the willingness of people to believe in something brighter. The Disney studio, once a fragile dream, now stood reborn. Its debts were gone, its future secure, and its walls ready to house stories that would enchant the world for generations. All of it was born from a gamble in the darkest years of the Depression, a gamble that paid off in brilliance. Flush with the triumph of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt Disney stood at the gates of possibility. The debts were cleared, the new studio in Burbank was rising, and for the first time in his career, he had both money and momentum. But Walt was not a man content with repeating himself. Where others might have coasted on the success of a single masterpiece, Walt saw only the next mountain to climb. To him, Snow White was proof that animation could move hearts. Now he wanted to prove it could do more: reach deeper, stretch further, and rival the greatest art of any age. The first project to follow was Pinocchio, 1940. A darker and more complex story than Snow White, based on Carlo Collodi's 19th century Italian tale. It followed a wooden puppet who longs to become a real boy, guided by conscience, yet lured by temptation. The film demanded unprecedented animation challenges: the subtle expressions of Geppetto, the fluid motion of Jiminy Cricket, and the terrifying sequences of Pleasure Island. The team employed the multiplane camera to new heights, creating scenes with breathtaking depth, such as Pinocchio walking underwater among flickering fish. The level of detail was staggering, and so was the cost. But Walt believed in pushing the craft, and Pinocchio remains, even today, one of the most technically accomplished animated films ever made. If Pinocchio was ambitious, Fantasia, 1940, was audacious. Walt envisioned it not as a conventional film, but as a symphony of animation and music. He collaborated with conductor Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra, weaving classical compositions Bach, Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky into animated sequences that ranged from abstract color patterns to dancing mushrooms, from mythic centaurs to the apocalyptic night on Bald Mountain. It was unlike anything audiences had seen. Part concert, part dream, part experiment. Walt even introduced Fantasound, an early stereophonic sound system that prefigured modern surround sound. But ambition carried risks. Both Pinocchio and Fantasia premiered as Europe descended into war, cutting off the lucrative overseas markets that had fueled Snow White's profits. Box office numbers disappointed, and the studio's finances, once buoyed, began to strain again. Yet artistically, the films set new standards. They proved that animation was not limited to fairy tales and slapstick, but could grapple with morality, abstraction, and grandeur. Even when audiences were unsure, Walt pressed forward, convinced that the future of animation lay in exploration, not repetition. The expansion did not stop there. Bambi, 1942, followed, with its delicate depictions of nature, its fluid animal movements, and its heartbreaking portrayal of loss. Later came Dumbo, a smaller project that unexpectedly charmed audiences with its humility and warmth. Each film carried the Disney stamp, technical innovation fused with emotional storytelling. Each pushed animators to their limits, forcing them to invent new techniques, refine their craft, and expand the very vocabulary of the medium. What tied these films together was Walt's refusal to settle. Success was never a finish line, only a launch pad. Even as the Depression lingered into the late 1930s and global war loomed, he pushed his studio to imagine bigger, stranger, and bolder works. Some gambles paid richly, others strained finances, but all expanded the reach of animation as an art form. The story resonates in 2025. Innovation, whether in cinema, technology, or culture, rarely flows in a straight line of profits. It surges, falters, and rises again. Walt's post-Snow White expansions remind us that progress is not measured only by balance sheets, but by daring. Pinocchio and Fantasia may not have matched Snow White in box office glory, but they left legacies that shaped the entire industry. For Walt Disney, the years after Snow White were not about safety, but about proving that imagination had no ceiling. He used his hard-won profits not to rest, but to reach. And though the risks nearly undid him again, the art that resulted still endures, still inspires, and still whispers the lesson of his life, that every triumph must be followed by another bold step, even into the unknown. Hardship, as cruel as it is, often forges the resilience that comfort never could. For Walt Disney, the Great Depression was both an obstacle and a crucible. His career rose not in an age of abundance, but in an era defined by scarcity, and it was precisely that scarcity which shaped the resilience and creativity that became the hallmarks of his empire. Consider the circumstances. When Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered in 1937, America had endured nearly a decade of economic turmoil. Millions were still unemployed, and countless families lived day to day, stretching meals, patching clothes, and wondering how long their luck would hold. The Depression was not just an economic crisis, it was a psychological one, eroding faith in the future. For an artist like Walt Disney, this was both a danger and an opportunity. It meant his audience was fragile, skeptical, desperate for something more than distraction. To succeed in such a time, he could not simply amuse, he had to inspire. The Depression taught Walt the value of persistence. His early failures with Lafogrim and the loss of Oswald had already tested his endurance. But the 1930s hardened that lesson. When his studio struggled under debt, when bankers rolled their eyes at his folly, and when even his animators questioned the point of endless late nights, Walt pressed forward. He had seen collapse before, and he knew that only by refusing to stop could one outlast despair. That resilience seeped into his characters. Mickey Mouse, cheerful in the face of trouble, embodied the optimism Walt refused to relinquish. Snow White, innocent yet unwavering, reflected the belief that light could survive even in the darkest forests. The Depression also sharpened Walt's sense of creativity as a necessity. Limited resources forced him to innovate. He could not compete with other studios by producing cheaply, so he competed by producing better. Technicolor, the multiplane camera, synchronized sound, and bold storytelling all came out of the conviction that quality would triumph over compromise. It was a philosophy born of hardship. When survival is uncertain, mediocrity is fatal. Innovation became not a gamble, but the only path forward. In many ways, Walt's approach mirrored the resilience of ordinary Americans in the 1930s. Families who grew gardens in empty lots, who mended clothes until the fabric gave way, who found joy in small rituals. They too turned necessity into creativity. Just as Walt stretched every dollar to experiment with animation, households stretched every scrap to keep children fed. Both reflected the same truth. Resilience is less about strength than about imagination. The ability to see possibility where others see only limitation. The Depression also taught Walt the importance of emotional depth. Audiences in those years were not content with frivolity alone. They responded to stories that carried heart, that acknowledged struggle, yet offered hope. This shaped Disney's insistence on emotional storytelling. Cartoons ceased to be gags strung together. They became tales of perseverance, community, and redemption. The Three Little Pigs was not just a children's song, it was a parable about standing firm against the big bad wolf of hardship. Snow White was not merely fantasy, it was reassurance that innocence could endure, even when threatened. Walt understood that laughter was necessary, but laughter mixed with hope was transformative. Looking at 2025, the resonance is clear. In an age of uncertainty, where headlines trumpet prosperity, yet undercurrents of anxiety hum beneath, the lesson of Walt's Depression-era resilience feels timely. Creativity thrives not because conditions are perfect, but because they are not. Challenges sharpen vision. Doubt fuels determination. Crisis forces innovation. Walt Disney did not simply survive the Depression, he was shaped by it. His resilience was born of failure, his creativity sharpened by scarcity. His empire built not on abundance, but on the courage to dream in a world that had stopped dreaming. That is why his legacy endures. It is not only the castles, the films, or the mouse, but the reminder that hardship, endured with imagination, can yield wonders no abundance could ever inspire. And so, when we watch Mickey whistle or Snow White sing, we are not just enjoying fairy tales. We are witnessing the resilience of a man and a generation who turned despair into delight. It is the quiet truth of history. Sometimes, it is the darkest soil that grows the brightest flowers. The story of Walt Disney rising from depression, hardship to build an empire is extraordinary, but it is not unique. History, if listened to closely, hums the same refrain again and again. Crisis is not only destruction, but also creation. The wreckage of one age often becomes the scaffolding for the next. What looks like collapse in the moment often appears, in hindsight, as the necessary shock that makes space for reinvention. Take the Black Death of the 14th century, which wiped out a third of Europe's population. It was catastrophe on a scale almost unimaginable. Fields lay fallow, cities emptied, and despair darkened daily life. Yet out of that devastation came shifts that remade Europe. Labor became more valuable as workers grew scarce. Peasants demanded better conditions, and social hierarchies began to wobble. The plague also stirred new currents in art and thought, loosening the rigid grip of medieval life and clearing the path toward the Renaissance. Out of pestilence, human creativity found fresh breath. Or consider the aftermath of the American Civil War. The destruction was immensities burned, families shattered, an economy fractured. Yet it was in that crucible that industrial America took shape. Railroads expanded, steel mills roared to life, and new inventions like the telephone and electric light reshaped daily existence. The war had torn the nation apart, but it had also accelerated its march into the modern age. The pattern repeated in the 20th century. World War I devastated Europe, yet it also produced advances in medicine, aviation, and communication that reshaped civilian life. Out of the rubble of World War II emerged not only the United Nations and the Marshall Plan, but also revolutions in technology, from computers to nuclear energy. Each crisis demanded responses, and those responses created new worlds. The Great Depression itself, which seemed at first to offer nothing but despair, was a furnace of innovation. The New Deal reimagined the role of government, laying foundations for social safety nets and public works that still endure. Writers like Steinbeck and photographers like Dorothea Lange captured human struggle in ways that reshaped literature and art. Jazz and swing music, lively and defiant, flourished in dance halls, even as hunger gnawed at daily life. And of course, Walt Disney transformed cartoons into cinematic art. Crisis did not silence creativity, it demanded it. The pattern is not confined to the distant past. In the 1970s, the oil crisis sent economies reeling. Yet it also spurred new thinking about energy, efficiency, and geopolitics. In 2008, the global financial crisis devastated markets, but it also gave birth to entire industries, from fintech to the gig economy. Even the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, though steeped in tragedy, accelerated digital transformation, remote work, and innovations in medicine that will shape generations. Again and again, history insists that collapse is not a period, it is a comma. Seen from 2025, this pattern feels both comforting and urgent. America today celebrates growth and record stock highs, yet beneath the surface, uncertainties stir geopolitical conflict, fragile supply chains, rising inequality, the restless shadow of inflation. The temptation is to see such fragility only as threat. But the deeper lesson of history is that fragility is also fertile. Out of turmoil, imagination blooms. Out of hardship, new voices rise. Somewhere in today's unease, the next Walt Disney may already be sketching their version of Mickey, a creation born from necessity that will one day enchant the world. The larger pattern is not a denial of suffering. Crises break lives, topple institutions, and leave scars. But they also clear away illusions, forcing humanity to adapt, to rethink, to dare. What was once mocked as folly can become the cornerstone of the future. Walt's foolish idea of a full-length cartoon became the foundation of an empire. So to have countless follies throughout history, ideas dismissed in their day, proved, in hindsight, to be seeds of transformation. And so, as we reflect on Disney's story within the wider arc of history, the lesson is clear: collapse and creation are companions. One clears the ground, the other builds upon it. To despair in crisis is natural, but to see only despair is to miss half the story. The other half is invention, resilience, and the stubborn human habit of dreaming in the dark. As we step back from the story of Walt Disney and the Great Depression, the larger lesson becomes less about one man and more about the rhythm of history itself. Crises, whether economic, political, or social, have always shaken the ground beneath our feet. They strip away illusions, reveal fragility, and force people to confront the limits of what they thought was secure. But just as surely, they create space for invention, resilience, and renewal. The Depression gave us breadlines. Yes, but it also gave us Mickey Mouse. In 2025, America once again finds itself at a curious crossroads. The headlines are glowing. GDP growth stronger than expected, stock markets reaching record highs, investors cheering. On the surface, the country hums with prosperity. Yet beneath that shimmer lies unease. Oil prices wobble with each geopolitical tremor. Inflation, though tamed, lingers in memory like a ghost. Ordinary families, even as they watch markets soar, still juggle bills, student loans, and the rising cost of daily life. It is a paradox not unlike 1929, when prosperity seemed permanent till it wasn't. Single quotes too. The lesson from the Depression is not that collapse is inevitable, but that fragility is real. It reminds us that growth, no matter how dazzling, must be tempered with humility. It is easy to believe, when numbers rise, that they will rise forever. Yet history whispers otherwise. And in that whisper lies an invitation to prepare, to innovate, to imagine what might be built when the ground shifts again. Disney's story offers a particular kind of hope. He did not wait for conditions to be perfect. He did not retreat when times grew harsh. Instead, he used adversity as fuel. The Depression taught him that people needed not only bread, but also beauty, not only work, but also wonder. By daring to dream bigger in a time of despair, he built something that endured far beyond his own lifetime. What might the equivalent be for us today? Perhaps it lies in the quiet persistence of scientists racing to solve climate change, or in entrepreneurs rethinking how economies can be both digital and humane. Perhaps it lies in artists who, in the middle of uncertainty, still choose to create beauty. Or perhaps it lies in ordinary families who, despite inflation and unease, continue to find laughter in small places. The spirit that once kept audiences buying tickets to see Mickey Mouse in the 1930s is the same spirit that carries us now. The refusal to surrender joy. The United States of 2025 is not the United States of 1929. Our challenges are different, our tools more advanced, yet the rhythm remains the same. Crisis may come. When it does, it will hurt, but it will also clear space for something new. The mouse that whistled in 1928 became a global icon because he carried within him a lesson larger than laughter, that resilience wears many disguises, and sometimes it looks like a grin in the face of despair. So as we reflect on the Depression, Disney, and our own moment, let us remember this. Prosperity is fragile, but imagination is not. What we build in times of comfort may crumble, but what we dream in times of hardship can last forever. And somewhere, even now, perhaps the next Mickey is being sketched on the back of a napkin, waiting for the world to need him. And if you're still awake, leave a 1 in the comments. It's comforting to know who's journeying with me through these quiet corridors of history, where despair and hope always walk side by side. The Great Depression is often remembered as a time of hunger, unemployment, and fear, and rightly so. It was a decade when the promise of endless prosperity dissolved almost overnight, when ordinary families discovered that savings, jobs, and security could vanish with terrifying speed. But to view it only through the lens of despair is to miss half the story. For out of that same darkness came resilience, innovation, and the quiet determination to imagine something better. And nowhere is this paradox more clearly embodied than in the story of Walt Disney. Walt's journey was not a straight line toward triumph. It was littered with failure, betrayal, and the constant threat of collapse. Lafogram fell apart in Kansas City. Oswald was stolen in Hollywood. Debts piled up as Snow White consumed every dollar the studio could borrow. At any point, he might have surrendered, might have taken a safer path, might have settled for less, but he didn't. He pressed forward, believing that imagination was worth the risk. In doing so, he not only survived the Depression, but gave the world characters and stories that endured long after the economy recovered. This is the deeper truth of history. Crises strip away illusions, but they also clear space for reinvention. The Depression destroyed institutions, but it also forced governments to reimagine their role, inspired artists to capture resilience in new forms, and pushed entrepreneurs to gamble on ideas that seemed foolish until they changed everything. From the ashes of despair came the soil of creativity. Walt Disney was not alone in this. The 1930s were filled with unexpected sparks. Swing music erupted from dance halls, offering rhythm when daily life felt stagnant. Writers like John Steinbeck gave voice to the voiceless, chronicling the struggles of migrants and workers. Engineers and inventors kept experimenting, laying the groundwork for technologies that would define the century. Even as millions suffered, millions also dreamed, and some of those dreams reshaped the world. The lesson is as relevant now as it was then. In 2025, America stands in a moment that feels, in some ways, eerily similar. The surface glitters, GDP growth stronger than forecast, the S&P 500 scaling new heights, investors celebrating as if the future has already been secured. But beneath that shimmer lie cracks. Oil markets twitch at every geopolitical tremor. Inflation lingers in memory like a scar. Housing costs gnaw at family budgets. And political polarization leaves citizens uncertain of tomorrow. It is prosperity wrapped in fragility, abundance perched on the edge of unease. The temptation in such times is to believe in permanence, to imagine that record highs will last forever, that the future is secured because the present feels golden. But the Depression reminds us how quickly such illusions can shatter. And yet, just as surely, it reminds us that even when collapse comes, creativity and resilience rise. That is the paradox we must hold, to recognize fragility without succumbing to despair, to prepare for hardship while still daring to dream. The story of Disney is especially powerful because it shows that innovation is not born from comfort, but from necessity. It was not in an age of plenty that Walt created Mickey and Snow White, but in an age of scarcity. He innovated because he had to, because failure left him no other option. That necessity sharpened his vision, honed his persistence, and gave his art the urgency that audiences felt in their bones. When people lined up for his films during the Depression, they weren't merely buying tickets, they were buying hope. And so the question for us in 2025 is simple. Where will our hope come from? Who or what will be our Mickey Mouse? Will it be a new technology that redefines how we live? A cultural movement that restores unity in divided times? An artist who dares to imagine beauty when the world feels fractured? We cannot predict the form it will take, but history reassures us that it will come. For every crisis carries within it the seed of its own renewal. There is also a more intimate lesson here, one that goes beyond economies and industries. Resilience is not only for nations and corporations, it is for individuals. Families in the Depression endured by pooling resources, by sharing meals, by finding joy in the smallest pleasures. Walt endured by sketching a mouse on a train ride home, by refusing to let betrayal define him. And perhaps, in our own quieter struggles, whether with jobs, relationships, or daily uncertainties, we too can draw strength from that example, to keep going, to keep imagining, to keep smiling. Even when the world feels unkind, that is its own kind of triumph. And so, as we bring this story to a close, let us not remember the Depression only as despair, nor Disney only as triumph, but both together. For it is in that tension, the dance between ruin and rebirth, that history moves forward. America in 2025, like America in 1929, will face shocks. Some may come sooner than we think. But just as Mickey whistled through hardship, just as Snow White sang through danger, we too can find ways to carry hope into the storm. Perhaps, in the end, that is the most enduring gift of Disney's rise. Not merely cartoons or castles, but a reminder that even the smallest figure, a mouse with a whistle, can carry a nation's spirit when it needs it most. So tonight, as we drift toward sleep, let us carry that lesson with us. Crisis is real, but so is resilience. Collapse is painful, but so is creation. And if history has taught us anything, it is that even in the darkest valleys, the seeds of light are already waiting to bloom. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If you found it calming, thought-provoking, or simply enjoyable, I invite you to support this journey. Like the video, subscribe for more gentle stories from history, and share your own reflections in the comments. And maybe, just maybe, leave a note, because even in this quiet corner of the internet, your voice is part of the light we carry together.